There's been some breaking news from the Russia Investigation Committee, the Russian investigators in charge of finding out what exactly happened. Of course, there have been many detained already, and it appears that the Russian investigators are drawing linkages to Ukrainian nationalists, especially in regard to financing relating to cryptocurrency and the like. Of course, this may not come as a surprise, given that several of the perpetrators were fleeing to the Ukrainian border via the Bryansk region. So I'll just kick it to whoever wants to begin. What is the significance of this, especially in lieu and in light of all that you guys have been covering with regard to this conflict? Why is this, especially, and maybe you can answer this question, but why is this attack different than maybe others that we have seen, whether it's attacks that Ukraine has definitely committed, terrorist attacks on Russian territory, or just the landscape of terrorism in general?
Well, if I can start, in some ways, it is very like other attacks that have been committed. I mean, there have been Islamist attacks in Europe. You haven't had them so much in the US, but in Europe, there have been several occasions when Islamist terrorists have carried out attacks of this kind. They've stormed buildings, they've killed large numbers of people, they've aimed to kill large numbers of people. It's happened in the city where I live, which is in London in 2006. As I remember, they exploded devices in the London metro. Lots of people were killed at that time. So the indiscriminate, violent nature of this attack is consistent with the behavior of Islamist terrorists. And we've had claims from Amaq, which is the news agency that is connected to ISIS, that ISIS is responsible. We've had videos shown by Amaq which show the actual attack taking place. All of this is very consistent with what terrorists of this kind would be expected to do. But then there are the anomalies, and they do exist. And I think it's important to say that we don't know how significant these anomalies are at the moment, but they do exist. And people in the West who deny that they exist are not being frank or not well informed. Firstly, these 4 gunmen very quickly identified, very quickly captured. Now, that isn't consistent with the way in which gunmen who carry out these kind of attacks behave. Normally, they're carefully selected, they're highly trained, they're highly motivated, they're carefully prepared. Often they're wearing suicide vests. Their reward is martyrdom. They expect to go to heaven. That's what they're told will happen if they carry out one of these attacks. It's an affirmation of faith. They're holy warriors. They're not expected to survive these attacks. These 4 gunmen did aim to survive. They left the building, they got into a car, they fled, and of course they fled towards the Ukrainian border. And that is unusual. And when the Russian authorities caught up with them, instead of fighting to the death, as these people tend to do when they're cornered, they allowed themselves to be caught. And they have been caught, and they have been talking. So this is anomalous. This is not typical of these kind of attacks. Now, there might be explanations. It might be that ISIS is declining, ISIS is becoming different, but it is strange. And going back to this linkage that the Russians are making, the key point about this is 2 things. Firstly, obviously, this is happening in the middle of an armed conflict between Ukraine and Russia. The Ukrainians have made attacks on Russian territory, not of this nature, not on this scale, but there have been attacks. And secondly, these people were fleeing towards the Ukrainian border. Now, so far, there's not been much explanation of that or much discussion of it in the West.
Yeah, Alexander, spot on. The West is not talking about the fact that the terrorists were making their way to the border. They don't want to mention that. All they say is Ukraine has nothing to do with this, and it's ISIS. We're 100% convinced that it's ISIS. Ukraine has nothing to do with this. So that's been the narrative from everyone in the collective West, whether it's the Biden White House, whether it's Macron or the UK or Schultz. That's the script that they've been handed, and that's what they're going with. Maybe they're right. Maybe Ukraine has nothing to do with this. Maybe ISIS-K, not even ISIS, ISIS-K is behind this. But the investigation is moving very quickly, and I think we'll find out in a matter of days or at most weeks exactly what's going on. But everything is pointing to some sort of Ukraine involvement. The cryptocurrency is actually interesting. That's very interesting. I'm on Zero Hedge right now. I'm sorry. FTX founder Sam Bankman-Fried sentenced to 25 years in prison. Remember FTX and Ukraine and all the crypto stuff that was going on in Ukraine with all the FTX and United 24, which is the charity organization that was set up for Zelensky, which was taking donations in Bitcoin. I don't know. I don't know if any of this is connected, but crypto and Ukraine, obviously they have something going on there as well. So I don't know, but that's an interesting angle, the whole crypto, paying them in crypto. I think that's pretty interesting, but we'll see. We'll see what's going on here. The Russians are going to get to the bottom of this, and I think that's worrying the U.S. I would just say this, Danny. Me and Alexander did a show on this topic, and that should be up by tomorrow. But if it was me advising the Biden White House, as far as their communications department, at least, I would have told the Biden White House when this tragedy happened. I would have said, look, come out with a statement, condemn this terrorist act, send your condolences to the people of Russia. Tell the Russians that you're going to work with them in order to catch these guys. Say something along the lines of, despite our conflict or despite our tensions or whatever you want, however you want to phrase it, we're going to work together with the Russian authorities in order to catch these terrorists. And just leave it there. Leave it there. Why they talked ISIS, why they talked Ukraine, I have no idea why they brought all of this into it. Even if they know something, even if they have information that it's ISIS-K or Ukraine's not involved, whatever, even if they have this information, I don't know why they brought it up right away, a couple of hours after the terrorist attack. That would have been how I would have handled it, but what do I know?
I would just quickly add to that they brought up the denial that Ukraine was involved before anyone in Russia in authority had alleged that Ukraine was involved.
Why?
I mean, it was most odd.
Yeah, why, Alexander? Why, Danny? Why bring that up? So
I think it was within 55 minutes, actually, of the reports that this attack happened. That's what you had. And I mean, there's Kamala Harris going in front of, the biggest of mainstream media saying exactly that. It's ISIS-K. It's not Ukraine. Not Ukraine. And of course, you've had Maria Zakharova and numerous Russian officials talk about how this is very suspicious, that there's already this deniability, this denial coming out, when I think I heard you, Alexander, say this in a program, that they're not a party to the matter, the event. There's no way that the United States could have known unless, and now we're hearing this kind of back and forth from Russia and the United States. The United States said, we warned you, right? We warned you. We wanted to warn you. We warned you, but you didn't want to listen to us. And Russia has been saying, no, absolutely not. You're trying to blackmail us by saying that you wanted to warn us, but in fact, your actions and behaviors has led to the deterioration of any kind of counterterrorism cooperation. So, I mean, I'll just throw that out if Alexander or Alex.
Well, absolutely. I mean, no, we've even had an article now about all of this in the New York Times, because just going back to that original warning, which we haven't seen the warning, we don't know what exactly the Americans privately were saying to the Russians. What we do know is what the two embassies, the American and British embassies in Moscow, said. And they warned American and British citizens in Moscow that there would be a there was a real danger of a terrorist incident within the next 48 hours, and that they should stay away from public gatherings, including concerts. That was what they said. Now, they said extremists, they didn't say Islamist extremists, for example. That is not in the warning. They were very vague about, the warning itself was a bit vague. And of course, it was limited to 48 hours. Now, this attack took place several weeks after that warning was given. So it did not happen within the 48-hour period of the warning itself, the public warning. And if you were an American or a British citizen in Moscow, you might have said to yourself, well, the warning period has expired, so why shouldn't I attend a concert? Just saying. Now, what the Americans said to the Russians and what the Russians said to the Americans in private, we don't really know. But the New York Times suggests that the Americans weren't saying very much, probably not much more than what that public warning that was made on the 7th of March said. And this is a product of the total collapse in the relationship between these two countries. So even on a question of intelligence cooperation to fight terrorism, they're not cooperating and working together anymore. So the Americans aren't giving the Russians all the information they have, and the Russians don't trust the very incomplete information that the Americans are giving them.
Yeah, I think this New York Times article's not helping the Biden White House. I understand why they're running it. They're trying to explain away what happened, because when the terrorist attack happened, Kirby came out, and in one of his first statements, he did send his condolences. The Biden White House did send their condolences to the Russian people, and Kirby said that we condemn terrorism. And then a reporter asked Kirby, is this connected to the March 7th, March 8th announcement? And Kirby said, I'm going to consult with the State Department. This is what he said. I'm going to consult with the State Department, but I don't think the message from March 7th or 8th is connected to this attack. That's what Kirby said. It's on video. That's what he said. As Alexander pointed out the other day in the live stream, the March 7th, March 8th posting from the State Department, it was a 48-hour warning. 48 hours. It wasn't a 1-month warning. There wasn't another warning posted on March 22nd, 23rd, 24th. There was nothing like that. It was a 48-hour warning. And I mentioned this in a video about a week, like 4 or 5 days ago. I was on Twitter and I saw a couple of accounts from people in Moscow who were saying that on that day, March 9th or 10th, there was a shaman concert, perhaps the biggest pop rock star in Russia today, and he was playing at that same exact venue. And a lot of people were posting on Twitter that they went to that concert, and the security was very tight. And the speculation, it's just speculation. The speculation is that perhaps that's what they were targeting. Perhaps the 48-hour warning was covering that time window. And because the security was so tight, things had to get pushed back to the next event, which was the picnic concert on the 23rd of 2022 or 23rd of March. But this article from the New York Times is now saying, hey, because we have the conflict in Ukraine, we don't want to share all our intelligence with Russia. We were afraid that they might find out our sources or our methods. And because we have the conflict, we don't want to share intelligence about a terrorist attack that's going to kill civilians. Really? Really, United States of America? Really, Biden White House? Is that what you're going to go with? And it works both ways now, because what are the Russians going to do? If the Russians have intelligence about something that's going to happen, are they going to come up with the same excuse because of the conflict in Ukraine? We don't want to share information with Europe or the United States. This was a terrible article from the New York Times, in my opinion. But they're trying to cover their tracks.
Well, I'm going to say straightforwardly, of course, the Russians know what warning they were given. So I suspect that somebody in Washington is worried that the Russians will go public with the wording, whatever wording it was, of the private warning. And so they want to get ahead of the story and explain in advance why the warning that was given in private was not particularly detailed. And I think that we've got to take it from this New York Times article that it wasn't particularly detailed, because what else is it saying ultimately?
Yeah, I think the United States, of course, the Biden administration at the lead, I mean, looks really bad in this situation. I think that's why we've seen this event be covered very differently than maybe other terrorist attacks in the past worldwide. I mean, it hasn't been covered in the same kind of tone in the United States, in the West, as you know, usually when these things happen, especially in the West, there's a lot more of a somber tone. There's more talk about this. Some have even mentioned, especially all over Telegram, that the West is almost playing into this narrative that it was an inside job. There's some who have done that. I know Zelensky's regime has kind of made mention of this. I mean, given what we know about this conflict, though, between the United States, NATO, and Russia, what do you make of the comments from Alexander Bortnikov of the FSB chief? Russia has been, Putin in his address to the nation, Bortnikov, others have kind of said, we believe Ukraine is behind this, or at least involved in it. I don't think they said behind, but involved. The US, we believe they're involved. The UK, we believe they're involved. And this has angered the United States to the point where nearly every headline says that Russia is working hard to blame Ukraine, to pin it on anyone but ISIS. What do you make of these developments relating to this attack?
I think I'd like to just explain a few things. So Bortnikov is the head of the FSB, which is the Federal Security Service. It is Russia's counterintelligence, counter-terrorist agency, and it is also in control of the border. But as I understand it, they are not the primary investigative agency that's leading the investigation here. The investigative agency is a completely different body called the Investigative Committee, which is headed by somebody called Bastrikhin, and it is a police agency. So it is carrying out a criminal probe. The FSB obviously have some intelligence because they are an intelligence and a counterintelligence agency. But it's to Bastrikhin and the investigative committee, perhaps, that we should look to for actual information about what the investigation itself is telling us. But going back to Bortnikov, what Bortnikov basically said is this, and his words have not been, I think, fully understood. He said, there are indications, we have information. He actually said that. We have concrete information that Ukraine was involved in some way. He didn't tell us what that information was. And then he went on to say that because Ukraine is so heavily backed by the Western powers, the United States and Britain in particular, they are, since it looks as if Ukraine was involved, that means that the United States and Britain are ultimately responsible for it. He wasn't alleging that the British and the Americans actually sat down and planned this thing, but that's the connection that he was making. And I think that's going to be one that if there is a Ukrainian connection, or if the Russians say there is a Ukrainian connection, other Russians will be making even further. The more interesting thing, the most interesting point about Bortnikov's statement is that he said that the Russians have already got information which links Ukraine or someone in Ukraine to this attack. Now, we don't know what that might mean. It might be the mere fact that these people were heading towards the border, but we've just had this information about cryptocurrencies, for example, and that's more the kind of information that you would expect the FSB to find, because as an intelligence agency, they probably have ways of identifying movements in cryptocurrencies which perhaps the investigative committee, which is leading the investigation, doesn't have. And that might be what Bortnikov was referring to.
Yeah, if the Biden White House or the MI6, the UK has any brains whatsoever, they would be on the phone with Zelensky and telling him, you've got to throw someone under the bus.
Mhm.
Whoever did this, you've got to turn them over. We can't cover for you guys. I mean, that would that would be the smart thing for them to do, because the Russians, they're obviously they're going to find the Ukraine link. If a Ukraine link exists or it doesn't, they're going to find the Ukraine link. And the damning evidence for me is, and I don't think this is disputed, is that the car was making its way to Ukraine. So, Alexander pointed out, this is a very heavily guarded border. It's not the easiest border to cross. It's a war zone. So there must have been some entity that was going to move these guys over the border, I imagine. They could have gone in so many other directions. The smart thing for them to do would have been to just stay put in Moscow, I would guess. But they're making their way to Ukraine. I don't think that's being disputed. And the Russians are gonna find a Ukraine connection. I mean, that they're telling us they're going to find a Ukraine connection. So, the fact that the FSB is coming out and saying, well, if there's a Ukraine connection, well, there must be then a UK or a US connection. Well, of course, because you have a Washington Post story which came out 6 months ago, which talked about the CIA's ties to the SBU and how they were involved in the assassination of Daria Dugina, and they were pleading with the intel agencies in Ukraine to not go after Russian civilians, to not conduct operations inside of Russia. You had a New York Times article which came out last month, which talked about 12 CIA bunkers right on the border with Russia, and how the intel agencies have been trained by the U.S. intel agencies. You have these German commanders talking about how the UK, they're the ones that are operating the Storm Shadow missiles. Well, they've been talking about their involvement in Ukraine for the past 2 years, and now what do they expect the FSB to say? That there's no communication with the collective West in this instance? Of course not. Of course they're not going to say that. And of course, the Russian people are going to expect the FSB and the Russian government to say, well, behind these guys, there must be some collective West connection. It's they did this to themselves. They need to, if there are any brains in the collective West, they need to dump this Project Ukraine right away, because this is bringing the collective West down. We've said this for 2 years. This whole Project Ukraine is bringing the collective West down. But they can't disassociate. They can't stop.
No, and let's say they find the Ukraine connection and the evidence is released in whatever form Russia decides to release it to the public. I mean, how will this influence the conflict? Will it change anything about what happens from here on out? Maybe Alexander, if you wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it will. I mean, the first thing to say is that, of course, if they do find a Ukrainian connection, it'll be important to know what that connection is. I mean, does it involve the Ukrainian authorities? Because, as I understand it, they're talking about Ukrainian nationalists that might not be government people. But if it is, if the Ukrainian government was involved, aiding and abetting in an act like this in Moscow is an act of war, legally speaking. And the Russians could upgrade the special military operation higher if they chose to, either perhaps to a counterterrorism operation. I mean, that might be one option. Or they could go even further and they could do what Peskov, Putin's spokesman, hinted at a few days ago, which is that they could go all the way up and say that this is a war. This is a simple, straightforward war, legally speaking. And in that case, various things that they haven't been doing up to this point, they might start to do, like blowing up bridges across the Dnieper, attacking power stations, going after the political leaders of Ukraine, doing all sorts of things that they haven't up to this point done. We'll just have to wait and see. And Putin is nothing if not an extremely careful man, and he always consults widely, and he'll probably consult with other world leaders as well and see what they have to say. But potentially, this is very big.
I would also add that diplomatically, they've lost the narrative now. Information-wise, media-wise, and diplomatically, they've lost the narrative, because if there was any doubt from any countries in the global majority, in the global South, about whether this war was a provocation, or if Russia had any type of justification to wage this conflict in Ukraine, or if this was some sort of NATO proxy war with Russia, if they managed to establish a connection in Ukraine, well, then Russia, this goes from an unprovoked conflict to a provoked conflict. And the global majority is just going to rally further behind Russia. They're going to say, well, yeah, you guys were provoked. And not only were you provoked, but you have these nationalists now. And this plays right into Putin's denazification, where Putin now can come out and say, well, you see, I was telling you guys way at the beginning, we need to denazify Ukraine. And now look, we have these nationalists. If there is indeed a nationalist connection, we have these nationalists that will never leave us alone. We'll never be safe unless we get rid of these guys. This is gonna play perfectly into Russia's narrative, if this is indeed the case, and this was nationalists that were behind this terrorist attack.
And we'll have to see what that means. And we'll have to see what the investigative committee, because it's the investigative committee that's telling this, and is talking about these cryptocurrency transfers. But as I said, they've obviously had this from the FSB. We need to find out what we need to see where exactly this leads to. But if the Russians could put names to this, names of people in Ukraine who were responsible for transferring the funds, which they say played a role in making this attack possible, and they prove that kind of link, or at least they prove that kind of link to the satisfaction of most people in Russia and around the world, then of course the Russians can say that these people should be handed over to them. And then that becomes all very interesting and rather concerning, because Ukraine is probably not going to be willing to hand over those people. And then there have been instances in the past when countries that have been the target of terrorist attacks give ultimatums to countries that they say, are protecting those who were involved with the terrorists. And well, that can lead to all sorts of extraordinary consequences. As an example, let's go back all the way to 2001. The United States and its allies gave a ultimatum to Afghanistan, to the then Taliban government there, and said, you must hand over Osama bin Laden, and if you don't, we're at war with you. So, there are precedents for taking this a lot further than the Russians have done up to this point.
Thank you for tuning in to my latest video. I appreciate all of your support. This channel, however, needs your help. I am seeking to make this channel more sustainable in the long term and upgrade necessary equipment to ensure that this work continues onward and makes progress to give you all of the geopolitical analysis that you all deserve. For that reason, I'm asking you to become a member of my Patreon community at patreon.com/DannyDhaiphong. You can find that link in the video description or in the pinned comment below. For whatever amount you choose to give, just know you are supporting independent media that you can't find anywhere else. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the next video.